know Katie or know Katie's work, but yeah, I'm really thrilled to introduce Katie Beswick to this webinar. Katie is a writer and academic, and she currently leads the BA in Arts Management at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her 2019 monograph, Social Housing in Performance, explored representations of English council estates in theatre and performance, and she's also written widely on issues of housing activism and its intersections with performance and class in British theatre. And I'd say her monograph is a sort of a go-to read, I think, for those interested in the intersections of class, housing, kind of urban identity, and architecture with theatre and performance. So yeah, I'm thrilled to present her this evening, and she's going to be talking about tenancy, theatre, and gentrification in London. And I'm going to hand over to Katie.
Thank you. It's always nice to know people read the books you write because you sort of sit in a bit of you write a book and you hope people are reading it, so that's nice. Um, Hello, can everyone can you see Joe my PowerPoint? Is that
Yes, yes, we can see
all?
it.
And only my PowerPoint, nothing else.
Yeah.
Great. Bear with me. I'm just minimizing some things. Yeah, hello. Thank you everyone for coming to my talk. Tenancy, theatre and gentrification in London. So today I want to think a little bit about the figure of the tenant in conceptions of London's gentrification landscape from sort of 2010 on, and in recent theatrical representations of London's housing culture. Now, I say from 2010 on, but I do at one point go back to the 19th century, but that's contextual. So, this talk then builds on my earlier work on housing encapsulated in the monograph that Joe just mentioned. So I didn't focus in that book on the tenant figure, but I was concerned with the people that live in social housing or council housing. Those people are usually understood as renters and therefore as tenants, although actually the tenancy of council estates in the UK is very complicated, but we won't go into that now. But the important thing to say is really that I was concerned with those people because they're implicated by wider discourses about housing. And my overarching argument in that book was that theatre and performance has a role in the production of space in kind of Lefebvrean terms, wherein representations circulate to reinforce, disrupt, and remake ideas of the council estate in the public imagination. So, in other words, pretty obviously, there's a relationship of one kind or another between what happens in theatre and performance and the sort of wider social and political conditions that we live in. So today I kind of revisit some of those ideas, but particularly with this focus on understanding what the re-emergence of the figure of the tenant on the contemporary London stage and in wider British culture, and indeed global culture, from the mid-2010s on, might tell us about the overarching conditions of housing in which we are operating. And I'm speaking now, I'm always tempted to blur my background. I find it really sort of interesting how to do this in talks, but I'm speaking now from my bedroom in a house in London. And I guess just to say that, like, everybody is at the sharp end of the housing crisis in London, as we'll go on to talk about. There is no space. I don't have an office space. I work in my bedroom, and there's another room that my family live in. So you know, I think that those conditions, making those conditions visible, I kind of felt might be important for this talk, if it looks a bit kind of weird behind me. Um, on its British website, the media outlet Vice regularly publishes a satirical commentary feature called London Rental Opportunity of the Week. Well, it did up until 2023. So this feature ran from 2015 to 2023. And in this feature, the journalist Joel Golby selects a rental advert for a property in London, typically taken from a popular national property marketing website such as Zoopla or Rightmove or Gumtree. Those tend to be the the websites people use to rent here. And he issues a caustic takedown of the property on offer, whose price often equals or exceeds the average monthly wage of all but the very wealthy, and is likely to strike the average reader as hugely disproportionate to the quality and comfort of the advertised dwelling. So in a characteristic example, he summarises what's on offer for £1,052 per calendar month in the northwest London district of Willesden Green. He writes, 2 wardrobes with the poisonous looming energy of a small town bouncer's, and 2 beds with the temporary energy of all the members of your family crammed into one house overnight ahead of a funeral. So I think this is quite telling about the ways in which the kind of gross hyper commodification of London is now just kind of an accepted fact. Yeah, it's no longer possible to argue that London rentals facilitate anything other than the financial interests of the rich. As the apparently endless material fueling London rental opportunity of the week revealed, homes, especially in desirable metropoles such as London, do not primarily function anymore as basic human necessities providing shelter and comfort. Rather, they are crudely reduced to individual units from which as much monetary value as possible can be extracted, a phenomenon known as hypercommodification. So by selecting the most egregious examples of hyper-commodified housing, Golby's feature presents the state of the housing market in London as ludicrous. The column satirises not only how the neoliberal city prices out low and average income earners, but also how the process of neoliberal financialisation through the housing market relies on untruths and obfuscation. Yeah, it sends up the artifice of estate agent marketing speak to reveal such opportunities for what they really are, exploitative means of accruing profit for the landlord. So in a Financial Times review of Anna Minton's book that I'm sure you'll all know, Big Capital 2016, Nathan Brooker writes, if the price of food had risen at the same rate as London's house prices over the past 40 years, then a chicken would now cost £100. That's how deranged the city's property market has become. At the beginning of 1996, the average home for a first-time buyer in London cost 2.6 times the median salary. At the end of last year, this is 2016, it was more than 10 times and more than 30 in the wealthy London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And we'll come back to Kensington and Chelsea in a minute. Minton's book offers an account of the acceleration towards financialisation London's housing market has undergone in the 21st century. So processes of gentrification, which have been ongoing, since at least the 1970s in formerly working class districts of London, such as Islington, Camden and Hackney, and other major urban centres across the globe, now result in seemingly ever increasing house prices, the displacement of lower income residents. And these kind of, these have been well documented in scholarship over the years. But since the turn of the 21st century, these kind of gentrification processes with increasing velocity in London, particularly post the 2012 Olympics, have seen working class and even formerly middle class areas of the capital undergo huge and unprecedented change, such that the effects of gentrification across and within discrete districts are evidence now of a housing crisis in the city. So the leading British homeless charity Shelter says that the housing crisis is a crisis that's generally understood as the result of inflated house prices, spiralling rents, and a shortage of social housing, which produce ever more precarity for low and average income earners. In London, the crisis is especially acute. Average house purchase and rental prices here are higher than almost anywhere else in the UK, and indeed many, many other places in the world. Meanwhile, social housing shortage in the capital has resulted in widespread social cleansing. So this term social cleansing is used in the literature to talk about the phenomenon where those on lower incomes are forced out of the city by a profit-driven housing policy and the private development of social housing estates, effectively removing working-class Londoners from the city. So often, new developments in London are marketed and sold to overseas investors who will never live in them before they are made available for rental or purchase to local residents. So this drives up house prices, but it also means there's loads and loads of property in London that just sits empty. So London is effectively like a bank for the world, while people who have formerly lived in now developed areas are moved out of London, often away from their networks, to devastating consequences. So the London housing crisis has particular impacts on young people and the so-called millennial generation. That's those born after 1980 up to the turn of the 21st century, who are far less likely to own their own home than were their parents' generation, and who experience particular modes of housing and economic insecurity. So, the phenomenon of sharing housing among professional adults is widespread sharing of housing among professional adults who don't know each other is one of these particular phenomena. The tendency of this demographic to live in shared rented accommodation, to continue living with parents into adulthood, and the difficulty to own their own home in cities such as London at any point in their lifetime has led to the label generation rent being applied colloquially to millennials and increasingly to those born in the late 90s and early 2000s, sometimes now referred to as Generation Z. And I think, when we talk about kind of generational crisis, it can be a bit of a problem because it sort of erases the idea of class, which is obviously ever present, but I won't go into that now because it's a different argument. This is all to say, really, this is kind of a criticism of neoliberalism, which is the culture of unregulated financialization and hyper-commodification. So this, in kind of city terms, in terms of urban regeneration, urban regeneration has been really what I want to say is like a feature of the neoliberalization of the city. And for me, this neoliberalization of the city is like a step on from gentrification, when we've gentrified and then we're hyper commodifying at huge speed. So urban regeneration has frequently been, as I say, a feature of neoliberal cities. And these neoliberal processes are generally understood as those that are driven by privatization of formerly public entities like housing estates, deregulation, so getting rid of red tape, financialization, make as much money as possible, and globalization, being on a global market. So it's important here to emphasize that neoliberalism is nothing more than a particular form of capitalism. So Sarah Brillet points out that too often those using the term neoliberalism do so as a result of a reluctance to name capitalism as the culprit in the destitution and immiseration of people's lives. But neoliberalism is this unique set of policy provisions that attend to the attempts to secure profitability amid crisis, which became definitive for capitalism from the early 1970s on. And that's a quote from Sarah Brillet. So we can see this move towards neoliberal governance written into the architecture of the city via the skyscraper. If the modernist high-rise tower block in London provided the utopian promise of decent, affordable homes for everyone following the devastation caused by two wars, then the modern skyscraper stands as a testament to the power and influence of global financial interests. In London, the role of the skyscraper, is a direct result of deregulation, which allowed higher buildings to be built in certain parts of the city where nothing above, I think, the level of St. Paul's Cathedral was a regulation that was in place until about the turn of the 21st century. But the role of the skyscraper, is illustrated, I think, most clearly by the controversial building, the Shard. There's a picture of the Shard on that slide. The Shard is a 95-story tower designed to look like a giant shard of glass, and it sits as part of the Shard complex at London Bridge. It has 95% ownership by the state of Qatar, and the building includes luxury hotels, restaurants, and residential apartments. And it's completely altered the skyline of London and that bit of London. It is a futuristic, hypermodern icon to global investment that emphasises London's connection to globalised capital, that structures the skyline of other advanced neoliberal cities like New York, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. So the Shard's one of a number of one of a number of skyscrapers that has been erected in London since the turn of the 20th into the 21st century, including the Gherkin at 30 St Mary's Axe, 2004, Heron Tower at 110 Bishopsgate, which was built in 2008, and the Walkie Talkie, as it's called, at Fenchurch Street, which was finished in 2010. These skyscrapers point to the hyper commodification of the city and are a visible reminder of the scale of recent change to the fabric of London and of kind of the way that you can't stop global power moving in. So I'm going to turn now to the idea of the tenant, a bit of an abrupt term, but we'll come back to kind of neoliberal London in a minute. So a tenant, for my purposes and for the purposes of the dictionary, is a person who occupies land or property for rent from a landlord. So this figure, the scholar Matthew Ingleby has identified, became particularly prevalent in literature and drama, in the British literature and drama, particularly in the 19th century, when the word tenant, as he maps, began to be more frequently used in public and political discourse. Now, I'm quoting from Matt Ingleby, who I don't think has published this work yet, but has given various talks as part of his Rent Cultures network. If you're interested, I can put you in touch with that network, but I didn't want to talk about it without citing him. So we might map this emergence of the tenant as a key literary and dramatic character onto a changing political consciousness around the landlord-tenant relationship in particular, which, if this changed political consciousness eventually leads to a swathe of social housing provision changes in England through the 20th century. So many of these 19th century plays focus on the landlord-tenant relationship and on housing insecurity and its relationship to wider insecurities of work and economy. And I've listed a couple there. And I'd like to thank Kate Newey, who is a Victorian Studies scholar at the University of Exeter, who's helped me find some of these 19th century texts, because it's not my period. And Kate Newey also tells me that this theme of kind of the housing precarity and the landlord-tenant relationship is also really prevalent in melodramas of working class life. The Cruikshank's print sequences, which are a collection of prints and drawings, particularly The Bottle and The Drunkard's Children, had stage adaptations, several times throughout the 19th century. And there's a plot in them about eviction as a result of the father's drinking, which again, points to this kind of housing insecurity and kind of wider economic insecurity that at the period. So these kind of the through the 19th century, these narratives, end up feeding into or reflecting this change in a political understanding about rights to property and about an awareness of the effects of housing precarity. And this is contemporaneous with housing reform, which targets slum dwellings and landlords at the kind of end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And this is kind of where the establishment of social housing as it comes to kind of dominate British housing culture in the 20th century begins. It's really, the beginnings of anything are contested, right? But the Housing of the Working Classes Act in 1890 gives rise to kind of the first social housing estate in East London's Bethnal Green in 1896. And then there's a succession of acts through the early to 20th century through to the post-war, through which council housing is developed. And, I'm a real advocate for the British council housing model, because there was a period of time where huge numbers of the British population were housed in social housing, in kind of safe, secure, low rental housing, and that only really begins to change as a result of neoliberal policy. So I'm not particularly, for those of you who don't know, the right to buy, which was a policy introduced by the Thatcher government in 1980, which saw people able to buy their socially rented properties at council rented properties at a massively reduced rate. So, for example, my grandmother bought her house, which she eventually sold for about £400,000. She bought that for £8,000 under the right to buy. So we had this mass selling off of houses that were then bought up by landlords who now rent them privately. Most British people will be aware of that, but I'm not sure about overseas. Anyway, So I'm not a 19th century scholar, but there are interesting parallels, I think, between that time period and now in terms of kind of housing, and particularly in terms of political consciousness leading to housing reform. And I propose that this can be seen in the re-emergence of the figure of the tenant in contemporary drama through the late 2010s. So from about 2015, when Golby starts writing his London Rental Opportunity of the Week, to now, we start to see this figure of the tenant on the stage, but also as part of a wider recognition of the tenant as a significant political figure. And this re-emergence of the tenant on kind of the activist scene and within the political housing movement is something I know is, you know, has really been recognised by scholars, and that there's a lot of emerging scholarship on this. So I heard David Madden of the LSE give a talk at a housing studies conference last year about the role of the tenant in successful housing movements. And there's a forthcoming book by Baker, Ferrer and Stein about the tenant figure in North American housing activism. So what seems to be emerging in the scholarly scholarship and as the political position in scholarly work is that tenant-led activism across the globe has given the tenant a renewed, or the idea of the tenant, a renewed political power, and wrought some changes in legislation and housing practice that have been beneficial to the tenant. And this isn't to say that, we're still in housing crisis. I'm not over egging the pudding here, but we can see that that there's been changes. So in the UK, the Renters' Rights Bill, which is due to become law in 2025, it fails and it falls short in many of the most radical demands around tenancy rights, particularly, there's no rent caps in the bill, which is one of the things that tenants have really called for, but it does set out improved conditions for renters in terms of security, affordability, transparency, and discrimination. And there's the introduction of the landlord ombudsman, so there will be like oversight over landlords, which there currently isn't. So there is this emerging political recognition of the tenant, and I think this becomes visible, as I say, in dramas around London housing before it's really recognised by scholars of activism, and perhaps even before it. These things are always happening at the same time, but certainly before we've got kind of mass recognition of the importance of the tenant, that's already happening on stage, which I think is quite interesting. But for me, the significant difference between these plays, the ones that are happening now, and the 19th century plays, is that neoliberalism has kind of diluted the human element. So a lot of the 19th century plays are about like the human interaction between the landlord and the tenant, often the tenant's living in the landlord's house. And there is still some literature that works like that. But more often than not, we see what I would say is a systemic and often anonymous relationship between the tenant and the state, which comes under scrutiny and under which the kind of characters on stage are living. And also what is different about what's happening now is that recent examples tend to reference real life events or to be autobiographical in one way or another. That isn't quite the same in the 19th century examples, or isn't quite as explicit in the 19th century examples. So I can't really mention this kind of change in how we see the tenant without talking about the Grenfell Tower fire. So this change in how we see the tenant is partly the result of the public mood and political consensus that surrounded this horrific event, which has become a catalytic moment in terms of discussions of London's housing crisis. So what happened was that, for those who don't know, a fire broke out in a tower block on a social housing estate in the West London borough of Kensington and Chelsea, one of the most wealthy boroughs with the highest house prices in London. And the fire took hold of the building, completely engulfing it really, really quickly. And this was because the cladding on the facade of the building was combustible. And so the fire spread uncontrollably. At least 72 people died. At the time, there was a lot of argument over the how many people had died, but the official number is 72, and many more were injured and displaced. So Nicholas Kent and Richard Norton Taylor staged a 2020, or wrote a 2021, one of their testimony plays called Value Engineering: Scenes from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, which staged elements of the public inquiry for those who weren't able to follow the full public inquiry. And this is part of a sequence of testimony plays that these writers have made. It was staged less than a mile from where the fire took place, and it indicates how neoliberal policies led to oversights, errors, and outright untruths that resulted in mass fatality, and which I contend are illustrative of a wider affective housing culture in London and beyond. So this is about the way that housing, when I talk about affective housing culture, how people feel living in London, knowing the conditions of housing that they have to navigate. And there have been several artists who have kind of approached this. So in her play Refuge Woman, the writer and performer Cash Caraway gives some insight into the effective results of the fire for those in proximity to the tragedy. She describes how the children in the emergency accommodation close to Grenfell, where she lived at the time, became plagued by nightmares, terrified that they might die next. Meanwhile, the poet Caleb Femi, who grew up in London's North Peckham council estate, it's now been demolished, he writes how his phone began to auto-correct the word grief to Grenfell as he struggled to make sense of the tragedy through text messages with his friends. He asks, "Is this how collective mourning works?" The sense of powerlessness, grief, and fear felt by those living in high-rise accommodation in London and elsewhere, where similar cladding is ubiquitous on both social and private accommodation, has been an effective result of the fire. So there's lots of writing about how frightened people feel living in these kind of bad buildings. In London, housing conditions, like a canary in a coal mine, the miners used to go down the mine with a canary who would tell them if the conditions were dangerous, have provided a warning that the atmosphere of hyper-commodification under neoliberalism is no longer safe, and that lives are at risk as a result of overarching political structures that govern the essential aspects of our lives, such as access to housing. So there's a lot I could say about Grenfell, but in terms of the concept of the tenant in drama and the wider political imagination, what we have here is a silencing of the tenants and residents. So I say tenants and residents because some of the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire owned their homes under leaseholder agreements. Again, a very complicated property ownership in the UK that I won't go into, but we can talk about it afterwards if anyone's interested. So it's quite widely known, that the residents of Grenfell Tower predicted that there was going to be a catastrophic incident, a safety incident where people would die ahead of the fire. They were ignored by the local authority. And there's been kind of a reckoning with that, I think. And that is about a need that the public have had to recognise the tenants' humanity, voice, and assert them in the frame of this wider systemic failure in which they were invisible and in which they were ignored. And so I've listed there just a few of the many kind of plays that have sprung up that are directly reference Grenfell or about Grenfell. Gillian Slovo's National Theatre play, which I think is currently on in New York, or was recently on in New York. The Norton Taylor testimony plays, local community groups work. There is, to some extent, I think, in all of these plays, a need for the tenant in one way or another as a human agent to be recognised. And the question at the centre of all of these plays in different ways is about the relationship that the tenants of these properties have with the state and often with one another, not just the landlord, but also the whole neoliberal system where the landlord is just like one cog in a really complicated wheel of governance. So we can see this kind of question about the anonymity of residents and the overlooking of the humanity of tenants in works that predate Grenfell. And this is where I think it's interesting to kind of look at what's been happening in the theatre. So some of these, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Shit Theatre's Letters to Windsor House, which is kind of a widely cited play about the housing crisis. And in this duo, Louise Mothersole and Rebecca, I want to say her name is Biscuit, but it may be pronounced differently, who are the duo that comprise Shit Theatre. They offer an account of their time as in a kind of in the style that they present in, which is a kind of live art satirical style. They dress as post boxes at one point. They offer an account of their time as private tenants in a local authority flat in Manor House, which is a formerly still really working class district of East London. And the central conceit of the play is that the current tenants, the two who are in the house, and this is this is a true story and that it is a story of their life in this property. They start to open letters that are addressed to former tenants of the property, and then they begin to investigate these former tenants' lives, make assumptions about what's happening to these former tenants, obsess about them, invent fantastical stories for them. The Guardian describes how these former tenants haunted the piece, and the scholar Jen Harvey has written about the psychogeography of this performance, which cracks open the emotional resonances of life for London tenants in a neoliberal system. The play speaks more widely to the crisis. So at one point, the tenants aren't sure whether they are even tenants of this flat or whether they're subletting from a current local authority tenant. They're not really sure about their relationship to their landlord. That's really complicated. But the play also kind of points outside their own residency. At one point, they go to a local high-end development posing as people who are going to buy a flat, and the sales representative tells them that there's security in place that will keep residents of this high-rise building safe from the local people of Manor Park. So this play is a direct comment on the housing system in which tenancy and the tenant are positioned as these kind of nebulous positions, often invisible, and in a confusing wider system of global commerce that blights the lives of people trying to live in London, particularly those kind of on low incomes. So the final thing I want to talk about before we open this up to conversation is Beats and Elements 2019 play High Rise State of Mind. So the plot of this is a play that is a piece of hip hop theatre and made by Beats and Elements, who are a hip hop theatre company. The plot of the play is delivered almost entirely through rap, dialogue, and song. With the performers, there's 4 performers, and it's a very simple set out of 4 chairs on a stage, and the performers are on or near their chairs while they're in character. So the plot is that a doctor, Dr. David, moves into the mid-level of a newly built Mark I apartment, which is part of the fictional City Heights development. He's waited on by a sycophantic Jobsworth building manager called Tony. Meanwhile, a couple, Luke and Michelle, move into the bottom floor of the apartment complex. So the couple on this bottom floor try to cope with the cramped living conditions and the noise from neighbouring homes, and their relationship comes under strain. Meanwhile, Michelle, the lady of the couple, meets Dr. David in the building's elevator, and he immediately fancies her, and she soon takes up residence in his mid-level apartment, which leaves Luke alone on the first floor. Dr. David, though, is unable to find sort of happiness through his carnal and consumer pursuits, and he grows ever more dissatisfied, gorging on luxury food and cocaine. Life in the apartment complex eventually descends into chaos. Luke is evicted from the building, and Dr. David and Michelle fester loveless in their mid-floor complex as armed residents patrol the floors outside. Dr. David eventually dies by suicide, and Tony, the building manager, threatens Luke with murder should he return to the premises. A dead dog falls from the roof of the building. This plot is interspersed with real-world stories from the performers' experiences of London housing, so they step to the front of the stage and speak as themselves. And the play therefore becomes a reflection, again, on these psychological consequences of architecture and of housing policies, which make it impossible for individual humans to thrive, absent of conditions under which all humanity might thrive. So if, as Ned Bauman argues, Ballard's novel, so The High Rise State of Mind is based on it's an adaptation of High Rise, if that might be understood as a reflection on how architecture can transform the moral and sentimental lives of human beings, then High Rise State of Mind connects via the performer's real-world stories, so the fictional and real-world stories connect the destruction of the moral, spiritual and sentimental lives of London's tenants caused by the specific conditions that shape London housing conditions. The estate of mind in the title points both to London's diminishing stock of social housing, usually on estates, and to the role of the state in creating the circumstances on which the production reflects. This includes the wider context of the Grenfell Tower fire, as well as the micro-injustices faced by all low and average income Londoners trying to get by in a hyper-commodified and extremely expensive city. So the soundscape of the play it can be positioned as part of the oral turn that Dushka Rajloshevich, I didn't pronounce her name right, sorry about that, argues constitutes a paradigm shift in 21st century theatre. The sonic aspects of the performance invoke the sensory experience of millennial Londoners. It draws on hip hop, grime, and spoken word, which have come to dominate the urban cultural scene. At points, the music seems to break out of the confines of the fictional world of the play and becomes a direct comment on the state of London and the world. Certainly, the lyrics of many of the tracks offer specific critiques of London's housing experience. So, on Looking Up, for example, Paul Cree, who's one of the performers, describes the modernist high-rise building. He says, "Welcome to City Heights. It's the pinnacle of civil engineering design, modern metropolitan living now redefined, an architectural tribute to mankind." He sort of hints at the way that the neoliberal ideology is built into the modernist architecture that's come to define neoliberalism. So he says, "Walk the walkways, be inspired, spiritually climb, let the individual flourish, we encourage one to rise." And this is kind of a comment on the fact that many of London's housing estates were initially built according to principles that were intended patronisingly to morally improve the lives of the tenants before they were sold off to corporate interests or otherwise fell into disrepair. There's another song called What Floor, in which the company link the poor housing conditions that many residents experience and the resulting youth crime and despondency to spiritual and moral failings. And so he says, like, what floor are we on? How do we get off? And does God know that we're here? Conrad Murray, who's another member of the cast, he raps that the rubbish stuck in the chutes is like a metaphor for the youth. He's referring here to the clogged rubbish chutes that are used as waste disposal systems in a lot of London's high-rise and social housing. And then they reference the sort of bland corporate skyline that's come to define the city by asking, what's the cost of architectural holocaust? Answering himself with habitat of the lost cause. And this again points out the way that Londoners are left out of the city of the city's future, and there's lots of examples, basically, in the lyrics of the play, to the references of the kind of skyline of the city. So they talk about the shard, there's metal rungs, and there's sharp shards, and so on. So if the story of high-rise state of mind is dystopian, with the tenant figure a victim of the neoliberal city, the form and methods of production offer the audience some practical and aesthetic strategies whereby pleasure is created and through which this kind of dystopian affect might be more easily born. This is evident, in the way that the play offers the truths of the cast to an audience by these real-world moments, a formal technique as a rapper step out of character and address the audience directly with their housing stories. And this uses truth, I think, as a strategy for connection between the fiction and reality presented on stage, but also between the performers and its spectators. It draws on hip-hop traditions of realness, where trust is gained, and I've nearly finished now, through a truthful relationship between the content of a performance, to give expression to experiences often silenced or marginalised in mainstream political discourse. So I'm going to bring this to an end now, and we can have a bit of a conversation, but hopefully I've begun to rattle at some of the texture of what I see as a political moment around tenancy in London and how this is reflected in the theatre in specific ways. Thank you.